Do you guys remember these pictures? Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Kente Clough, taking a knee. We want to represent African Americans so much, we're going to go back to their motherland. Kente Clough, right on. All right, so then this one, make your own meme. Make whatever meme you want for this. This looks utterly ridiculous on so many levels. So, have fun. But again, we want to show that we're pro-African American, so we're going to go to the motherland and get some Kente Clough. Nancy Pelosi, we're doing this in order to commemorate the murder of George Floyd and the protests, and to show solidarity with the protesters that was inspired by George Floyd. I had to be honest, none of this is worthy of his name. Performative measures are not worthy of his name. And by worthy of his name, I don't quite know what that means entirely from the standpoint of name. But I would say, basically, what that translates into is to be, in some way, measure it with the preposterous nature of the crime juxtaposed against the crowds. Meaning, you had so many people out there in the streets. You have to have something that balances that equation. Not to mention, those people are in the streets to some degree for the deficit of justice that had taken place over time, that has just built up to the boiling point, to watch, like I said, the obscene and ridiculous contradiction of a man casually killing somebody, unencumbered by the crowd that's belligerent, and for that matter, even unencumbered by the fact that he's being videotaped. Hands in pockets, casually murdering a man, as that man pleads bloody murder for his life. He's handcuffed, he's not moving, and yet that knee stood there on his throat for another 2 minutes. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer reveals their hand. They fall flat on their faces in dealing with this particular issue. And I'm going to show you what I mean by this in a moment. But I want to say this. Democrats have fundamentally broken black politics. I don't mean this in the sense of a black nationalist perspective. I mean this in the perspective of the way they deal with issues of class. Meaning, I have no issue with standing in solidarity with races, classes, identities, or for that matter, gender issues. Yes, solidarity. I don't want anyone mistreated in this country. Just as a basis of operation, if I have somewhat of a libertarian view in regards to the way I want to interact with the world myself, well, I want to be the same for other people. I want them to have freedom of movement, per se. And that level of discretion or freedom of discretion in the country, to some degree, is encumbered if somebody is being racist or otherwise mistreating them. So, no issue with identity stuff. My issue is that economics was taken off the table in lieu of the identity stuff. Because what it was understood to be that basically people will fight for their identities. If you are black, if you are gay, if you are maybe Hispanic, you have a thing in your head that has an understanding almost from a generational aspect of what discrimination is and what it means and the forms that it takes that are somewhat silent and unannounced, but there and ever present nonetheless. You know it, flesh to bone. And all of you also know that the monsters are the other party. I don't mean that in the literal sense. I mean that in a figurative sense, in the way it's kind of seen. What keeps the monsters at bay? The Democrats know this, and they say, we will keep the monsters at bay. We will be a placeholder, and we will defend your identities. By the same token, we will give 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Economics is off the table in lieu of identity. Now, the catch here is Republicans have their own identity politics in regards to the way they try to corral white voters. But I'm just making the point that both of these parties are working with identity. And both of these parties are having this fight with economics being completely removed from the equation. You have nowhere else to go. Now, the catch here is back in the 60s, black politics was connected to economics. It had to be connected to economics. How could it not be? If you are a commodity from the standpoint of the way this country sees you or have seen you over time, and then you change it to basically low-cost labor, and there's a financial disparity between one class or one race and the other that is dramatic, and you know that that comes from the vestiges of slavery and then the way the society has basically eliminated you from any position where you could be economically, let's say, secure. Well, if that's the case, then your focus has to be on dealing with the issues that affect your population. When Martin Luther King is marching for increasing in the minimum wage, yeah, that's going beyond the notion of race, but what they firmly understood was that any notion of race has to be, or any notion of you being treated as an equal, has to be part and parcel to that being economically sufficient. Meaning, yes, I treat you as my equal black man as you live in this kind of squalor. No, equality also has to mean to some degree some level of economic justice. Now, the point I'm making here is that was firmly understood back then. It's the rational thing to do. If you're looking this from the standpoint of class and you're African American, those two things are intertwined. They're not separate or distinct. And African Americans back then knew it. As they got more infused into the Democratic Party, and as the Democratic Party moved further and further to the left with this nonsense of blue no matter who, it became perfectly okay to put in a black face, despite the fact that the black face was doing the same thing that the white face was doing. With the smattering of telling you some kind of identity stuff. I hope you understand what I mean. At some point, this notion of class being intrinsically linked to the notion of race, especially from the standpoint of African Americans, and I would even make a case at this point, even for whites, but definitely from the standpoint of African Americans. And that gets severed somewhere along the line, especially under Clinton, and especially when you get to Obama. The blackface in and of itself was sufficient, not the economic relief that you and your community is screaming for. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi don their kente cloth and yet can't remember the name of George Floyd. It's performative garbage. And I told you it was performative trash when they did it. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This video is not going to be long because there's not much to it. I just want to make the point that when I say this is performative, I want to get across how performative it is, how little it really means to them when they say this stuff, that it's done just to try to ingratiate themselves to a community to which they can't ingratiate themselves to, because they can't give that community what that community wants. So if that community said defund the police, the key here is defund the police, but also use the resources and funding of that money to support those communities. Now, I told you early on when this first happened, I said Democratic Party is going to look at this entirely through the lens of cops. It's all the cops' fault. Cops' responsibility. Missing the point that they're putting cops in situations to which those cops have no powers to do anything about. So instead of them saying, if you're going to deal with issues of cops and policing, part of that equation is getting rid of the poverty and the abandonment of those particular communities that create and incentivize crime. And in doing so, we will move those communities from the batch that has a high propensity for crime to a low propensity for crime. And we can organically lower the need for cops. Yes, you also have to do some about cops being maniacs. Agreed. But you also need to do some of the other side of that equation. And I made the point that Democrats weren't going to do that. They had nothing in them that believed in really doing that. They needed to put out performative measures to go after what they would consider to be the cops and then say, hey, see, we're representing you, while not representing you in the way that you need to be represented. They can't even remember George Floyd's name.
Families of Floyd Taylor, George Taylor.
I only will do that if you tell me that this legislation is worthy of George Kirby's name.
For the families of Floyd Taylor, George Taylor.
I only will do that if you tell me that this legislation is worthy of George Kirby's name.
I can't tell what that word was at the end of Nancy Pelosi. She hit the George, right? 50%. 50%. That's more than I thought they would remember. But you would think that they would have, competent people who would say, hey, George Floyd, repeat it back. George Taylor? No, fuck no. George Floyd. Okay, I got it. And then go on to say George Taylor. Because you cared that little about it. Look, your salvation is through economic empowerment. And part and parcel to that, as an African American, especially if you're dealing with the political space, you are just not being honest if you're not dealing with that issue. That issue breeds all sorts of contempt in regards to the communities themselves, as one community knows it's been fucked over based on the things that happened in the past leading up to like the 80s and 90s. They're not blind to that. Just because the country absolves itself of that in some kind of weird way doesn't necessarily mean that people who are on the blunt end of that don't care about that. And understand, as income inequality goes, so does resentment, meaning violent crimes increases with the amount of income inequality in a particular system. We are creating our monsters. And we're looking at this as if it's entirely the issue of the cops. I'm sorry, it's not. Performative measures are not what you need. These two are not representing your interests. They do want to get some notion of you giving them credit for wearing kente cloth and being able to kneel for 9 minutes or whatever. But is that really the thing that gets to the root and the nub of the issues that you have as a society? Especially from the standpoint of the poor, especially from the standpoint of African Americans. Because again, the poverty of whites does not match up to the poverty of blacks. There are more of you, don't misunderstand me, because there are just more whites in the country, but the levels are far deeper. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. I'll be right back, guys.